Hi, I'm Kenneth, and this is the Unspeakable Vice podcast, where we talk about talking about sex. Sex is a dirty word, a taboo. It's something that just isn't talked about, and we're about to dig into why. I was recently made aware that last week was National Coming Out Week, culminating with Sunday, National Coming Out Day. The tradition of celebrating people in the LGBTQ community coming out of the closet, making sure people know that they exist, is a wonderful example of positive sex communication in action. Coming out is an act of pride in one's sexual identity. It is also a political action that seeks to normalize alternate sexualities. The more people come out, the more people will see that it's a pretty regular thing, that some people are not heterosexual, or gender binary, or straight in whatever way that word has meaning to you. There's another side of the story, though. To celebrate coming out, to normalize coming out, even to make it a rite of passage into the LGBTQ community, as some do, is also to legitimize the idea that alternate sexualities are deviant. If they were normal, there would be no closet to come out of. Think about it. When was the last time you heard someone come out as straight? It doesn't happen because that's a normal sexual identity. When someone doesn't rock the heteronormative boat, their identities are unremarkable. There's no need for them to declare their identities because we have already made up assumptions about who they are. The only time someone needs to come out is when those assumptions are wrong, when their identity deviates from heteronormalcy. Standing up and saying, "Yes, I'm different," is cathartic, empowering, a boost to the self-confidence as you become a card-carrying, asking and telling member of a wonderful community. But it also says you're different. I'm not saying don't come out. I'm just dreaming of a world where coming out is boring. If you get on the rooftops and shout out who you are and feel great about it, wonderful. But in my dream world, people around you would look at you like you just declared your favorite pizza toppings. Because we can all appreciate pizza in different ways. And even if your favorites are not mine, it's really not that big of a deal. Anyway, this episode isn't about coming out. It's actually a conversation with another podcast host. She's been something of an inspiration to me because she's been walking the walk I've been talking about. In more ways than one, she's made a mission of normalizing talking about sex.
Hi, my name is Brienne. I am also a host of a sex podcast. My podcast is called Sex Communication, but I am also the founder of Graphic Paint, which is an umbrella brand that also produces sex communication. And the focus of the brand is to champion sex-positive projects. We're really centered around a website that's currently in development that's going to be an online community for people to share multimedia without sexual censorship, connect with others, be able to sell their own digital content, the only requirement being authenticity and certain very specific things that our merchant provider won't allow content-wise. But yeah, I'm just really looking to change the narrative around sex, but also the experience of interacting with sexual content, especially when it comes to the online world, which is where we all live 24 hours a day. So.
Okay, great. So I guess you and I have a common mission of normalizing talking about sex.
Right.
And as you know, there are many social pressures that make sex taboo, such as religion and morality laws and sort of thing. And there's also internal pressures, right? Fear and shame, things like that. So what do you see as the biggest barriers to being open about talking about sex today?
Well, I mean, again, I'm tackling this problem with the solution being online media. And I actually think the reason for that is because I think this is the biggest reinforcer of the stigma. Media is something that we access constantly. It's something that we internalize. And it takes ideas that, may have originated in religion. They may have originated in, family etiquette or, just tradition with government practice. But then when you see the way media handles sex, the way that sex is kind of segregated from all other types of content, like that just reinforces an otherness, and an otherness is just inherently negative. Anything that's segregated, we start to see the thing that's separated as like, that's a bad thing, and that's why it's separated. So it's, part of why I'm hoping to change how sex is presented. It's not just having the conversation, but really thinking about like, this is, meeting people where they are. We're carrying around phones. We have access to the internet all the time. And, media, whether it's through advertising, whether it's through blogs or news sites, or, even films, it's like, it's all reinforcing this idea that sex is something that you talk about somewhere else, but not in normal daily life. So.
I've sometimes imagined that this ideal world of talking about sex openly, it might look like the way that we talk about food. I don't know if you think that's a good comparison or not, but the recipe books and maybe a sex network on television, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Casual conversations about the best place to eat. Do you think this is a reasonable idea, or are there things about sex that make it special, make it unique, and where we should, even being open, should be more careful or reserved about the way that we talk about it?
No, I agree with what you're saying. I think, this stigma, it's not just about getting people to be more open about sex as far as, talking about what their sex life is, but it's like, how does that play out into all of the other things that we struggle with, right? Conversations about consent, conversations about trauma, and, like the negative stuff. People don't talk about the negative stuff as much as they don't talk about the positive stuff. So I just think, like the benefits are just, it's way beyond just normalizing and destigmatizing the topic. It's an opportunity for people to be more comfortable just sharing what has happened to them, whether it's good or bad, So I do think normalizing it so that it's to the point where it's just another topic, like you said, like food. That's part of what my vision for the site is like, it's not just sex, it's sex that's treated at the same level of importance and priority as we deal with every other topic, news and reviews and culture stuff and, whatever. It's all just life stuff. So why do we have to treat one part of life as a totally separate animal?
Right. So you mentioned consent, and I think that's an important topic. I'd like to get in a little more. People, when people think about not being open about sex, they might develop incorrect assumptions about what's normal and what's not.
Yeah.
People might miss out on pleasurable opportunities if they're not comfortable asking. But as you mentioned, consent is a part of it too. They might struggle to navigate that. Could you talk about that in a little more detail? Why this complexity about the good and the bad is both. I guess what I'm getting at is when people want to suppress sex or sex communication, a lot of times the rationale is that they don't want to be putting these ideas into people's head. If we don't talk about it, then it won't exist, or something like that. Can you talk about why that's not the case?
Well, when we're uncomfortable about things, we don't want to talk about them. And when you don't have those conversations, you can get into very dangerous situations. My perspective is very well informed, living as a cis woman and having been sexually assaulted multiple times throughout my life, as an adult, as a child, everywhere in between. And it's still difficult for me to have those conversations. Like even with doing the show, recording all these interviews, talking about it, writing about it, it's uncomfortable. There's like this fear of, I don't even know what it is. It's just like a baseless fear, this feeling attached to these conversations because they're so, like, it's just so uncommon, right? I don't know. I've never been advised on how to have the conversation. It's not something that's dealt with in school, or at least it wasn't in my experience. And is from what I can tell with even sex ed programs now, it's still not something that's tackled. So it's like where to start. And then, hesitation and discomfort with something like that. It carries over to like, well, do I feel comfortable asking for what I want in bed? It's all of the same conversation, but just like different angles of it. And not being able to talk about consent, it's, akin to not being able to stick up for yourself and allowing a situation to progress where you're not comfortable, you have not given consent, and yet something is happening to you and you're then dealing with the consequences of that. Giving somebody else power, giving somebody the entire control of a situation, what happens, how it's dealt with, because you're the one not speaking up. And I think people don't speak up because they don't know any better most of the time. And other times they know full well better, but they're not acting on it because it's so uncomfortable to have these conversations. Especially as a woman too, there's like a fear of what kind of violent reaction might befall me if I bring this up, if I say no, if, we've done X, Y, and Z, but I'm like, nope, not going to do this other thing. That's a very reasonable fear. It's a very reasonable fear. And it's unfortunate that it is sexual assault, especially with women, is as common as it is. It's plenty common with men as well, but it's become like a cultural norm to dominate women, especially in the US. And I know in other places it's even worse. In some places it's better, but I live in the States and that's been my experience. And it doesn't seem to have changed all that much, even for as sex positive as it's, become so trendy to be lately. It still doesn't not mitigate those risks.
Yeah, you say from your personal experience that it's still difficult to talk about, and I can certainly relate to that as well. I've had several years of telling my story, and it still can be very difficult at times. Do you see from your own experience that it gets easier, or that there's some healing from talking about it?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, another thing that I've been very open about is the fact that I'm sober. And I stay sober by participating in a 12-step recovery program. And at the heart of that program is sharing one's story, right? And sharing honestly, taking an honest inventory, just being fearless about like whatever your truth is, and knowing that, if you've done something wrong, it doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you, sick, or, like we're not necessarily, we can be defined by our actions, obviously, but it's like, the possibility of forgiveness, of change, and that it all comes from kind of acknowledgement and being very willing to accept responsibility for something by looking at it in a very honest, brutally honest way. So just given all of that, like I've shared about my own sexual assaults many times, both privately with people that I'm working with one-on-one, but also in the context of groups. And even still, like I still will, share it at a meeting and have somebody tell me that it's inappropriate that I talked about a certain part of my story. Which is my fucking story. If I want to talk about it, I'm going to talk about it. I mean, it definitely, all of those experiences have shaped who I am and why I am where I am and why I do what I do. And it's so important for other people to hear it and identify. And I have so many more people coming up to me, men and women and everything in between, saying, nobody ever talks about that. And I really appreciate that you shared about this particular topic because, this happened to me too. Which is another part with the site of being so open about these things. Like that's another way that we normalize things, right? It's not just seeing examples of it, but seeing or hearing very personal accounts, because then this isn't just something that a company created, right? It's not just a construct, that's been developed so that you perform a certain action. It's somebody honestly sharing their story so you can know that you are not alone and you have that opportunity to identify, which in turn just leads to, acceptance and feeling more connected and a whole host of other positive things.
So do you see that talking about it and understanding your past helps you to negotiate the present or the future in terms of asking what you want and
yeah, I mean, certainly if I didn't look back on those things with the perspective that I have, with the awareness and the acceptance, my eyes wouldn't be as open going forward into new things, right? Like plenty of things can happen to you, but if you never sit and examine how they happened and why they happened, and the circumstances around it, and how you felt afterwards. You're never going to give yourself the opportunity to behave in a different way, which is kind of what we're all looking for.
So part of the reason that as a culture we are afraid of sex is that it can be dangerous. Maybe we blow that out of proportion sometimes, but there's truth to it. It can be dangerous in the wrong context. And you mentioned sex ed for children, and so particularly we want to protect children or vulnerable people from sex. But at the same time, children are exposed to sex from the day they're born, right? We give them a sexual identity, male or female, and then there's all these sorts of cultural norms that come along with that about how you're supposed to behave. And even if we don't intend that to be sexual at first, it certainly is all related, I think, right? The ideas of normalizing masculine behavior are very much interrelated with issues of like you said, dominance and aggression, and I think there's a missing piece between what is normal for children to be exposed to and what they need to learn to be healthy adults in terms of sexuality. Do you think that there's something fundamentally wrong with our approach to sex ed, or do we just need to do a better job of communicating these things?
Well, I think there's a lot fundamentally wrong, a lot missing. My experience with sex ed was related to STIs and preventing pregnancy. So that's all very useful information, right? But like I said, consent is a huge missing part of that conversation, but also the idea of sexual pleasure. And, I understand a lot of people's hesitation with, just in the same way in the 90s, it was a whole thing about like, we don't want to offer condoms at school because this is just going to be encouraging everybody who sees or has access to a condom to have sex, which is not true. It's a matter of being open about healthy behavior. Like, it's one thing to, have a child only encounter unhealthy depictions and unhealthy demonstrations of sexuality, and another to, kind of force the issue with positive things. And, if we think about it very realistically, there is no child that is not aware of porn, right? And there's a whole backlash that, porn is so negative and porn is, ruining our kids and corrupting them. And, but that's the only real, I don't want to say honest, but like, but I mean explicit. I would say explicit. It's the only real explicit demonstration of sex that they have access to most of the time, because we're not offering an alternative. So what would it look like if we, instead of running away from how, we show sex, like they shouldn't be looking at sex. We don't want to look at it. We don't want to see it. We don't want to like have that exposure. We don't want to like go that far. You're giving them no alternative but to seek something out that will actually show them body parts and will actually show them action. So they don't have to wonder about the vagaries of, maybe illustrations or vague language in a book. Because, all these topics are skirted around, they're never addressed. And so that's what they seek out. So I just propose that we, embrace the topic and try to put, healthy things out there instead. And you can educate somebody much better. I think educational porn would be so useful. And I mean videos with real people having sex that you see. You can see what a trans person looks like. You can see what group sex looks like. You can see what it looks like for a woman to insert a tampon, or a trans, woman not dealing with that, and maybe a trans man menstruating. Like, being able to see these things in specifics, like education is power, and you're setting children up to be safer, to be, more able to advocate for themselves because they know the reality of something. When you just keep something under wraps, it's always going to lead to something that's not going to be good. But I mean, the information is out there. They're not going to not get it. So it's like, well, how about we give them good information instead? So, I think realism is very important. education about, that pleasure is a component of sex. It's not just like, how do you not get pregnant and how do you not catch herpes or AIDS or whatever? But like, how is this a part of normal life, and how can you be good at it, and how can you take your own pleasure into your own hands, i.e. masturbation. And it's not encouraging them to do it. It's just saying, this is the information that's out there, and I'm going to shoot straight with you and tell you all about it.
So let's talk about pornography and art more broadly. I guess, is there a distinction? Should we? I'm not sure what the best way is to use those words, but pornography tends to have a very negative association. But you're talking about a positive use of sexual art. Can you talk about what you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, just reality based. I mean, documentary style sex, that maybe would be less confusing, because the word pornography does bring with it a lot of connotations. And I mean, it even the definition is like, it's intended for arousal, which it's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm very pro porn, but I do recognize that there's bad porn out there, and there are some really good independent, very body positive, very gender inclusive creators of porn out there. They're few and far between, but I think in terms of using it for sex ed, I think is something that's not being tackled. I mean, I don't know anybody that's doing that. But I just think that would be real. I mean, I think about how when I grew up, asking my mother what a blowjob was, and she told me it meant to give oral pleasure, which at the time I was reading these books that would talk about oral presentations, and that it was about speaking skills. So I'm hearing this and I'm like, does that mean to like tell a good, like, I knew she was being vague, and it was just such confusing language. Like, what the fuck are you, this is not an answer, right? Yeah. But it's not like if I had somebody that was straight with me and said, no, this is what a blowjob is, or maybe showed me video of somebody giving somebody else a blowjob, I would have understood. And it wouldn't have been like, oh, well, now I'm going to go out and do that now because I've seen an example of it. I mean, that's just ludicrous. It just would have set me up better. And honestly, the reason why I was asking, because I was in 5th grade and I had a boyfriend a year older that was already talking about blowjobs. Like, don't you think it would have been helpful for your daughter to have known exactly what the guy was talking about? That would have made it safer for me. I mean, I felt incredibly uncomfortable being alone with him. Like, I didn't know what he was going to try to make me do. I don't have this actual idea of what a blowjob is. It was just, my fears and everything. And it's just such nonsense. But anyway, yeah. That answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, and thinking more broadly about your mission and the idea of normalizing sex, how do you think art plays into that, as opposed to just having conversations?
Well, it's funny. I'm also a visual artist, and I I don't care about art in this context, honestly. But I mean, when I think about that, I think about like erotica, which I hate. I don't know. I'm more interested in just in reality, in honesty. So, like when I said, documentary style depictions of sex, same with writing. I'm not into like erotic fiction or, whatever, but I love to read people's firsthand accounts of something that's true. So, I mean, again, that's my motivation for trying to drive that direction with the site, but I'm creating something that's crowdsourced, right? So at some point, I'm not going to be driving that ship. It's going to be a matter of like, what do people want to post? And a lot of people, that's how they are comfortable talking about sex and sharing about it. If they make things like as a creator that's helpful to them, which is great for them. It's not something I'm at all interested in. I don't think sex has been missing from art ever. I mean, just the fact that like nudes are so, it's such it's like a weird contradiction that, nude statues and paintings have been around for hundreds of years, and yet we're still uncomfortable with nudity. So I don't put a lot of stock in like art being able to save us in this situation. I truly think it's about like what is the truth? What are people really doing? And how can I see it or read about it or hear it? That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think sometimes I've thought that fiction in writing and art is the same way, but fiction is a way to talk about things that are too difficult to talk about otherwise. That
Yeah.
as a as a creator of that type of work, I think that can put some distance between me and the work in a way that allows me to express things that if I were just saying it directly might be too hard to do. Does that make sense?
It does. But like my gut reaction to it is like, it feels like spin, right? It feels like fantasy. And I don't think either of those things are helpful, especially, when I think about all the writing that's out there and how often the more popular depiction of something will be, an experience that a woman is having, but surprise, it's written by a cis man who has no idea and is, it unintentionally, well, maybe not unintentionally, but sharing information that's not useful, and somebody reading it like, oh, I'm supposed to quiver at a touch and we're going to, have simultaneous orgasm. Like, that's fucking bullshit. That's not helpful to anybody. And I just feel like, again, what is the truth?
Yeah.
Tell it to me straight. Show me people, neither of them can come to an orgasm, or one does and the other one's just like defeated. They just like, I just want to see the reality of it, because I think it also gives people the space, like a safe space to feel like I don't have to be performing. I don't have to, meet this expectation. I don't have to have a certain experience or a certain result. And it just lets them be where they are and, just be in the moment instead of shooting for something, which I think any creation, any art or fiction or whatever, movies, they're always striving for this ideal. I'm more, I mean, I enjoy my entertainment, false or otherwise, but when it comes to like changing a conversation and changing thinking and to educating people and to try to motivate changed behavior, I think reality all the way is the way to go.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. That's everything that I had to talk about. Is there anything that we didn't cover yet that you think is important and you'd like to bring up?
Let me see. Oh, well, I mean, this is an interesting thing I've been dealing with recently. So my podcast, I said, one of the things too with reality is like, I want to hear it also. So I didn't mention, but my podcast features episodes of audio porn, which is just audio recordings of real sex. And I was recently banned from my podcast platform for having pornographic content, which was really interesting to me, given that it was a completely audio only medium and that it's real. There is audio porn out there where it's actually people that are acting. They're like reading either erotica or maybe something that's factually based, but they're performing the reactions, they're performing the sounds. And that's not what I'm sharing. I'm sharing real people having sex or masturbating, and like, what does that really sound like? And it's funny, there is this immediate assumption, especially from, I have a more majority male listenership, which is not shocking to me. But anyway, I'm not putting them out there to turn people on. And in fact, when the idea occurred to me to use a podcast to put content like that out there, to even, like record sex and listen to it, it was never about that. It was about having the opportunity to hear something from a different perspective, or, I want to say look at something in a different perspective, but you're hearing it, you're not seeing it. But it just gives you different insight, right? I mean, there's something so disconnected about how we see sex. But I think, taking the visuals out of it, especially given, how kind of doctored a lot of visuals are, like, and just being able to listen to something, your understanding of the situation and the intimacy of it is just incredibly compelling. And I think even just from an anthropological standpoint, it's just like, why aren't we why haven't other people really been focusing on examining sexuality in this way? It's like more towards the science. So anyway, I did find a new podcast host after another try. So I'm actually coming off of hiatus today, and I was, grateful for this opportunity to do your show, because I was hoping it was going to get me a little, jazzed up to do it, because it's been really frustrating. The show's been out. We're almost at the end of our second year, and it's just like still dealing with this shit. I mean, it's just sounds of people having sex, and you wouldn't even know it if I didn't fucking put it in the title of the thing. Like, it was all prompted by Spotify taking down several of my episodes, and then my host Buzzsprout throw them under the bus, being like, oh, hey, fuck you, by the way, you got to take your podcast off of our platform by the 7th. It was a real whatever. Anyway, that's just
Yeah, that's a whole I've been thinking about doing an episode on censorship, actually, just because it's such a complicated and weird problem. There's certainly laws that fit into it as well, but the way things are set up, a lot of platforms have their own policies or whatever that go far beyond the law, and it's not clear if that's helpful or if it's actually serving the purpose that it is designed to. But I'm glad to hear that you're back up and running, and I'm looking forward to the future episodes.
Yes, you're gonna
thanks.
I haven't published your episode yet, so you were coming.
Okay, great. We can all look forward to that. So thanks for doing this. It was great talking with you.
Likewise, Kenneth. Thank you.
As you heard at the end there, Brianne interviewed me for her podcast, and that episode will be coming soon. I'll warn you that it's a much more personal and detailed conversation than anything I've discussed here, but in terms of honest and real conversation about sex, it certainly fits the bill. If that sounds like your cup of tea, I definitely encourage you to look for it. Take a look at her other episodes too. She's interviewed people in sex work as well as people who simply love sex. And if you want examples of what real sex communication is like, her podcast is the place to find them. It's called simply Sex Communication, and you can get it wherever you get your podcasts, except evidently Spotify. Go figure. Funny story, I almost hosted this podcast with Anchor FM until I saw that they were bought by Spotify, and Spotify's morality clause in their licensing agreement scared me away. So far, they haven't censored any of my episodes, though. Anyway, Brianne's other venture is graphic paint, so check that out too, especially in the near future. I, for one, am certainly looking forward to what comes of that project. So, thanks for listening.